welcome to another episode of the Tom Schimmer Podcast. Happy Monday, everyone. Hope everyone had a great weekend. I've been home for the past week, so no travel updates for you. It's been nice to be home for a week. I love my job. I love the travel, but waking up in the same bed every day is kind of a novelty. And certainly I've got another week of almost being at home every day. We've got one overnight in Phoenix coming up this week. So with the upcoming events this spring, speaking of this Wednesday, this week is the Summit on PLC at Work. That's the big conference in Solution Tree Conference in Phoenix, Arizona, February 28th through the 2nd. I'll be presenting on the 1st this week. Other events coming up this spring, the Grading from the Inside Out virtual 2-day training. That'll be April 4th and 11th. Standards-Based Learning in Action, that 2-day training. I'll be in Idaho Falls, Idaho, April 13th and 14th. The Assessment and Grading Conference will be in Atlanta, Georgia, April 24th to 26th. I'll be presenting on the 24th and 25th because Grading from the Inside Out, the 2-day training, will be in Salt Lake City, April 26th and 27th. And of course, we have the big Assessment Center Institute that's happening in Las Vegas, Nevada, May 24th to 26th. I'll have links in the show notes for all of those events should they be of interest to you. And also, you can find those events on the Solution Tree website. I also want to remind you, like I did a couple of weeks ago, that I have a new book coming out this spring, this April. It's called Redefining Student Accountability, a proactive approach to teaching behavior outside the gradebook. And it's all about how we teach responsibility and other student attributes without distorting their achievement levels or their achievement grades. You can pre-order that book now. It ships on April 21st when the book is officially published. And of course, I have a link in the show notes for that too. Thanks for tuning in again this week. A big welcome to any new listeners joining in for the first time, and a big thank you to longtime listeners. I really do appreciate all of you. This week, my guest is Dr. Shelley Moore. Shelley is an author and a fierce advocate for equity and inclusion, so that is going to be the focus of our conversation today. And in Assessment Corner, I want to talk about portfolios and one of the most important but often overlooked factors in successful long-term sustainability of using portfolios in a classroom or a school. So, that's today's plan. Let's get to it. My conversation with Shelley Moore is coming up, but first, don't at me. But I want to open this week by asking you a question. What is the last thing you said to yourself about yourself? Now, we all talk to ourselves and tell ourselves different stories. Some of those stories are fact, some of those stories are fiction. But I want you to take a moment right now and think about how you talk to yourself about yourself. Now, I'm thinking more about the things you say to yourself in terms of your personality or your characteristics. I mean, we all talk to ourselves for many reasons. Sometimes we're talking to ourselves about things that have actually happened. That's different. I'm talking more about how we judge ourselves and the things we say to ourselves that we sometimes aren't even aware that we are saying to ourselves. And here's the thing. The things we say to ourselves can often be things that we would never say to a friend or a family member. I think it's a fascinating psychological study in that we can often be more negative toward ourselves than we are to other people, even when we're in our private moments. When we talk about ourselves in a public forum, sometimes we speak the truth and sometimes we put on a performance. I mean, if everyone knows, for example, that you're not very good at something or you're average at something, and then you proceed to talk about it in terms of not being very good at something, then you're simply telling the truth, and you obviously have a level of self-awareness. But we all know there are times where we're really good at something, and then people start talking about it publicly, and we put on this aw shucks performance and pretend to be humble when everyone knows you're really good at it. So if you're really good at playing basketball, for example, or you're a really good writer, and people point that out, pretending that you're not is this kind of faux humility that can sometimes be necessary, I get it, but more often than not is irritating. It's probably more irritating to me than if you were just being honest about how good you were at something. Faux humility, as many of you who are longtime listeners to this podcast know, is definitely something I find most annoying. It is for sure in the top 5 things that I find least endearing about a person. And I say top 5, but truthfully, it's probably 1 or 2. And if I was thinking about it right now, I would say it's number 1. Okay, so I just workshopped that right here in front of you. Honestly, I can't think of anything I find more off-putting than faux humility. Anyway, so there are times in a public forum where we tell the truth, and there's times where we put on this performance. But I want you to think about those private moments. You're in the car, okay? Or, you're home alone. Or even, you're running on the treadmill, or you're out for a walk, or somewhere where it's just you and your thoughts, and you're talking to yourself. What's the last thing you said to yourself about yourself? Was it supportive? Was it forgiving? Was it even kind? Did you show yourself the kind of compassion that you would typically show a friend or a family member? Now, I know this is going to sound a bit strange, but I feel like sometimes we think without thinking. I mean, you're always thinking about something, which is why I have to laugh when I see some people's social media profile. I'm not laughing at them, but I see their social media profiles, and one of the descriptors they use for themselves is thinker. Oh, yeah. Okay, good to know. Good to know you think. We all think. Everybody's a thinker. But I think it's true that if we don't control our thoughts will control us. And if we just think on autopilot, if we act on autopilot and we talk to ourselves on autopilot, then we put ourselves in a position where we are susceptible to saying things to ourselves that we wouldn't say to anybody else, especially those who matter to us. Kristen Neff is an associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and according to an article I was reading online by Anissa Horton, Neff is considered one of the world's leading experts in self-compassion. Now, she defines, this being Neff, she defines self-compassion as, quote, treating ourselves kindly when we feel inadequate, with kindness and concern like we would treat a friend. And she contrasts this idea of self-compassion with self-esteem. And she says that self-esteem, quote, is a judgment on self-worth. Self-esteem has some problems because when we fail or we make a mistake, we feel badly about ourselves, end quote. Now, another psychologist, Rami Najjar, I think that's how you pronounce it, Nijjar, Rami Najjar, talks about why self-compassion is so challenging. And it's so challenging because there's a lot of shame associated with it. People tend to wonder, when we're showing ourselves self-compassion, am I being self-indulgent? Is this self-pity? Am I weak? What is it? Now, according to Najjar, because self-compassion helps us with how we internalize stress in the world, we actually, by showing ourselves self-compassion, we tend to be better equipped to deal with the challenging situations. This gives us more emotional energy to have better relationships with others. Now, in another article, Kristen Neff again challenged the idea that self-compassion is selfish. She said, quote, most people find that when they're absorbed in self-judgment, they actually have little bandwidth left over to think about anything other than their inadequate, worthless selves. But when, she goes on to say, when we can be kind and nurturing to ourselves, however, many of our emotional needs are being met, which leaves us in a better position to focus on others, end quote. One last thing to think about. Journalist and author Melissa Dahl suggests there are three things or three questions we can all use when practicing self-compassion, and this is the pathway forward. This is kind of the formula. First, she writes, think about how many people have experienced what you just experienced. 2, think about how you would respond if a friend was the one who experienced what you just experienced or what you just remembered, and they came to you and wanted to talk about it. How would you respond to that? And then 3, think about how a neutral observer would view the situation that's causing you to beat yourself up. Dahl's point is that when you force yourself to think about these 3 questions or these 3 ideas, you start to realize that you're not the only one who makes mistakes. You're not the only one who ever has negative experiences. The result of that is that you're less likely to attach those experiences to your sense of self-worth. And so Dahl finishes with this idea that, quote, maybe the most compassionate attitude you can take toward yourself is to stop obsessing about yourself, end quote. Now, if you aren't already, pay close attention to how you talk to yourself about yourself. Now, I don't pretend to have this all figured out. I need to work at this just like everyone else. We all need to be much kinder to ourselves. At least be as kind to yourself as you would be to a friend or a family member who thought or experienced the very same thing you just did.
3, 2, 1.
Joining me this week for the interview is Dr. Shelley Moore. Shelley is a highly sought-after teacher, researcher, speaker, and storyteller. She has worked with school districts and community organizations around the world in supporting and promoting equity for all learners. Her first book, entitled One Without the Other, was released in July of 2016. And to follow up, her TEDx talk, I should say, with the new title, is going to be released in the fall of 2023. So maybe we can talk about that as well. We are going to dig into the idea of inclusion, UDL, equity, and all points in between. Most importantly, Shelley is not only a fellow Canadian, she is a fellow BCer. And so we have that connection as well. And Shelley and I know a lot of the same people, but we've never met before. So really excited for this conversation. Shelley, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Tom. This is so fun.
Yeah, really excited to have you here. It's great to meet you. Yeah, ABC. That's right. Absolutely. Congratulations, by the way, on finishing your doctoral studies. I know you're very excited about that. And
hardest thing I
know from mutual friends that your work is very highly regarded, especially by two people. I have to say, Leanne Young and Katie Novak speak very highly of you and love the work that you do. And those are two people that I have tremendous respect for. Mm-hmm. So I'm thrilled to have you here, and I'm really excited that you agreed to be on the podcast.
Thank you.
Before we dig into some of the meat of the conversation, if you will, let's start with the rundown of your career. Can you highlight for listeners a little bit of the professional journey so far, the pathway? Where did you start your education career? What led you all the way to the point where you are today?
Okay. That's a good one. That's a good question. Okay. So, to start the story of my professional journey, I think I have to start like grade 3, because that's when I first realized that special education was a thing. That was the year that I was diagnosed with having a learning disability. And the year that I realized the school was not made for kids like me. And so as I kind of bumbled through my career and having really significant years, right, that had an impact, as we all often have, I knew that by the time I got to post-secondary that I wanted to be a teacher and to work with kids like me. Often the kids that have some challenging behavior, ADHD, the kids that like struggle. And so I went into special education at University of Alberta, and it took me a long time because universities are not very UDL-y, and shocking. And and so it took me a little bit of time. But I got there, and it was in Alberta, and it was kind of during when I graduated. It was 2003, and it was during the time when there was no teaching jobs. And so they would have these giant recruitment fairs to get teachers. And so a ton of jurisdictions from the States would come and because Canadian education is very strong.
Yeah.
And so I got recruited to teach in New York City, which was my very first job. I taught in the South Bronx. I saved no children of color. There was no movies made. It's very important. Although I would say that I think a really great movie would be if like How the Bronx Saved Me, because let me tell you, these kids were phenomenal. I was there for 2 years. I would have stayed longer, but they wanted me to get a master's, and I'm like, I am never going to school again. Like, forget it. But I was there for 2 years. I worked in elementary school, and this is where I started to and I tell this story to some of my groups where, you leave education and you're like, I got this. I know what I'm going to do. I have my philosophy. It's sound. And then you get into your career and you realize like, wow, I'm not ready for this. I'm not prepared for this. Like all of a sudden I had to do things I didn't agree with, that didn't align with my philosophy. And this is, I think, where there was a big kind of turning point for me, because as a special educator in this school, I had students on my caseload that had disabilities, but they weren't low incidence disabilities. Like I had no kids with Down syndrome or autism. Right. And we were considered an inclusive school. Like I was a co-teacher. And when I started asking questions about, well, where are the kids with Down syndrome, I learned, and this is not specific to New York, this happens all over the place, where students with the most significant disabilities were in a different district, not even just a different school, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, that's not inclusion. That's not what I was told inclusion is for everybody. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so, and so when I started asking questions, like, why are they in a different district? And the response I always got was, well, they need something different. And I'm like, what's the thing? Like well-meaning people.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like people didn't even realize that wasn't appropriate. And so, I mean, I'm in my first year of teaching. I'm not going to take on New York City, but it was kind of one of those things where it's like, you lay low and you're like, well, don't agree with that. Don't agree with that. So we end up, I think I did what many people do. You close your door, you do the best you can with the kids you have, knowing that there's so many factors that you can't control. And so I was there for 2 years, but that's when I started like thinking about this question. about the difference between inclusion and equity, and this
Right.
idea of like, you can be inclusive to the people who are in front of you, but like when we start asking the questions, who's not in front of you, that's when we really start to get into this, right? And there was a ton of kids who were not in front of us.
Mm-hmm.
And but it didn't bother everybody. And that was the part that I found more problematic,
Right.
but as a young teacher, no one listens to you. So I come to Canada and I get a job in a high school, which is actually like where I wanted to teach, kind of that grades 8 to 12 in kind of greater Vancouver area. And, it was better. There was kids with intellectual disabilities in the high school, but we were still kind of down a wing. And I'm just like, well, we're here. Is this inclusion? Like, we're here, but like we have our own door. And like, and again,
Yeah.
like well-meaning people didn't see it as a problem.
Right.
It's all they know. It's all they know. And so I really tried my best, Tom. I tried to shut down the program and put everybody in all of the classes, and I'd love to tell you that it went well. It didn't. It was awful. It was awful because
Yeah.
I learned that inclusion isn't just about physical existence, right?
Right.
It's been a long journey, but it was in that job in Vancouver, Greater Vancouver, that I was like, this is because I was working with kids with intellectual disabilities, and I found like a home there that I'd never felt before, like a kinship with the families and the kids, and a secret, which is, if we could figure it out for them, we could figure it out for everybody, because they were
Right.
just really obvious examples of what everybody needs, kind of thing. And so it
Mhm.
was a struggle, like it was a fight. So I was there for about 7 years. And then I went to the district at a district level position, supporting multiple high schools on including students with intellectual disabilities. And like our district was pretty good, especially when it came to electives, but there still weren't kids in academic classrooms, which was where my passion started to grow. Like, if we really believe that all kids can learn, why aren't kids in academic classrooms beyond grade 8, right? So
Right.
that was really what led me to my PhD. I still can't even believe I did it. Like,
Yeah.
I can't even believe that I've got this far. And so that was my research, was, what does it look like? Like, how do we support teachers to meaningfully include kids with intellectual disabilities in high school academic classrooms? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like for teachers? What does that look like for students? What does that look like for peers? And which brings me to today, because, and I first started off really talking about, what does inclusion look like for intellectual disabilities, but it has blown up to, how do we support inclusion for everyone? Because
Right.
it comes back to that, what these kids need, or what everybody needs,
Yeah.
but it's turned into
So
an inclusive conversation that still just talks about everyone but them. So it's just going to be a forever job.
it's going to be a forever job for sure. I'm still trying to get over the fact that you said you graduated in 2003 and I was 13 years into my career. So I'm still,
Yeah.
it's always those moments where you're confronted by, you actually are kind of old, Tom. That's where it,
Well, if it makes you feel better, I graduated high school in 97.
all right, I'll work
That's
with
a
that.
little
Then.
better, right?
That's a little better. Yeah, mine is 85, so
Okay,
I think you got a few years on you for sure. And listeners, you really should check out, if you haven't, and I'm sure many of you have, but Shelley's YouTube channel is fantastic. Like, it really is a model for how to do a YouTube channel for sure. And as I was watching one of your 5 More Minutes, and that's such a clever title as well. Like, you're doing everything right. One of your 5 More Minute videos on YouTube. And again, listeners, you got to check it out. Some great content. You described the evolution of inclusion, and I loved that video. I thought that was really, really well done.
The first one.
So that's right. And you described the evolution from exclusion to segregation to integration to inclusion. And listeners, you got to check that out. It's a really great progression of how Shelley lays that out, which I found fascinating. But you asked a question at the end, and this is the question I want to put to you. Can we still do better? So I want to turn that to you and say, Shelley, do you think there's another step? So past inclusion, what would be your answer to the question that you posed to people who are watching that video? Can we still do better? Do you think there's another evolution in inclusion? And if so, what is that?
Yeah. So if there's a visual that goes with that video.
Yeah.
And basically it's in all 4 of those: exclusion, segregation, integration, inclusion. It's basically a visual of a bubble. and a whole bunch of green dots. And then in each of those progressions, we're trying to figure out what to do with the dots that aren't green. So exclusion, they're totally out of the bubble. Segregation, they're out of the bubble but grouped together. Integration is they're in the bubble but they're still grouped together. And then inclusion is they're dispersed among all the green. And if you were to ask me when I first started my career what inclusion is, I would have said that. But I'm going to tell you a little quick story, Tom, about why I think we can do better. I was teaching a course at the University of British Columbia, and because I love the visual. It causes such a good conversation because I'll ask people to label them, and I've never had consensus because all of us have a different understanding about what inclusion is, which is a huge barrier to moving forward. So I always kind of start my courses and a lot of my Pro-D with this slide of this visual that says, what does inclusion mean? And I love it. Like I use this slide with parents and with teachers and with kids. So I show this to my students. They're all grad students, so they're all teachers. And one of my students rolls her eyes and humps. She's like, I hate this slide. And I'm like, her name's Julie. I have permission to tell this story. And I'm just like, Julie.
All right, Julie, we're coming for you.
Like, what are you doing? Pull yourself together. Like, don't you want to pass? What do you mean you hate this slide? This is a great slide. Like, no, this is an awful slide. She's like, I see this slide everywhere on Pro-D. I see this slide in conferences. That none of these are inclusion. I'm like, what do you mean? So she points to the inclusion bubble and she goes, so in the inclusion bubble, remember, there's a whole bunch of green dots and then a few dots that aren't green. She's like, okay. She's like, first of all, who are these green dots? Are those supposed to be the normal children? And I'm like, why you gotta say it like that, Julie? And then she's like, oh, and so the non-green dots, are those supposed to be the special needs children? And I'm like, well, now you're making it sound like it's a bad thing. And so I'm trying to see where she's going from this. She's like, okay, well, let's talk about this. She's like, I have a classroom right now. And she goes, first of all, I've never had that many green students in my class. I've never had that many normal children in my class. She's like, second, I'm going to tell you what happens to those non-green dots. The red dots, they have a red teacher and they follow a red plan. And the blue dots, they have a blue teacher, they follow a blue plan. Orange dots, orange teacher, orange plan. She goes, what all those plans have in common are their plans to make them green. That's not inclusion, that's assimilation. Can you imagine my face?
Julie coming in hot.
Julie, you pass. You pass. And it was just this whole moment of this misunderstanding that even I was just like, oh my goodness, you're so right. What she described was exactly special education, which evolved out of the medical model.
Right.
Because, if you're not where you should be, something is wrong. Our entire funding model is designed based on this medical model. Right. And, if you're not where you should be, something's wrong. And then we have these little, we assess, we diagnose. If we can't figure it out, we send them to a specialist. Like, they might as well have a broken leg. And then we make these plans. We put resources into these plans and these assessments to fix them. But is that really the goal? Is the goal really to remove disability from students? And we had this whole conversation around, what if we viewed any other identity that way? What if we looked at queer students that way? What if we looked at racialized students that way? I mean, we have a whole history of looking at Indigenous students that way. And so we had this whole conversation around is inclusion changing who kids are to fit into a status quo? Or is inclusion understanding that the goal is not to be the same? Is inclusion helping? Because even kids who are green and doing everything right are having a hard time, right? And so then we're like, well, what if inclusion was not making everyone green? What if inclusion was helping kids find their colors? What if inclusion was helping them be brighter? And you realize that, inclusion, what it's really becoming to me is not just about including kids who are different, but planning for, anticipating, and teaching to difference. And that idea of teaching to diversity, and then even extending that to, can we even teach to diversity if kids don't feel safe identifying who they are? Right. And that whole extended of what inclusion today means to me is that we're not just teaching to diversity, but teaching to identity, helping kids to be this is who I am, but understanding that disability is also an identity, right? That needs to exist, not needs to change or, turn into someone without a disability. We understand that, I hope, in every other identity, but we still don't see disability as an identity. We see it as something that needs to be fixed. We see it as a medical deficit.
As a deficit, yeah.
It's a deficit that and so I mean, our funding models, our contract language, everything is based on disability as being a burden. And so no wonder kids aren't identifying. And so that, to me, can we still do better? Yeah, we can see disability as a part of the human condition,
Yeah.
right? As something that we need in our classrooms, just like any identity.
Wow. Julie got her PhD that day.
Julie passed.
Julie, if you're out there,
Julie
I wanna talk
passed.
to
She can teach the class.
you.
No, it
That's
was
assimilation.
it
That's
was
a great story.
It was a
Wow, that's
significant learning moment for me, and
I would imagine.
but it
Yeah,
made
what
me
an
also
insight.
realize like what a misunderstanding people have about inclusion. Like even
Right.
something as simple as adapting and modifying.
Right. Yeah, no, that
It's a
that is
retrofit,
a
right? Like it changes how I look at everything.
I can imagine you're probably just thinking, look, Julie, I'm just trying to put some dots on the screen
Right?
trying to explain these concepts. Like, back off a little bit.
It also happened. It was like the day that I
You
was.
don't have to go top shelf on me,
Yes.
Julie. Like, slow down.
I know, but woo, it was my birthday that day. I'm like, thanks for that
Oh,
gift.
God.
Thanks.
I know. Thanks for making me feel so small. I'm glad I'm your teacher.
Like, I'm not sleeping for days, Julie. Thanks.
Julie. Who is this Julie? I want to meet her. Let's
Yeah,
let's
no,
get
go introduce
let's have that
Julie.
conversation.
No, so it was a pretty
Julie.
profound moment for me.
Oh, I would imagine for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah, it's interesting. What I loved about that video and the way you laid it out, it's just so the way you progressed that through and how thoughtful that was in terms of the evolution, because I think sometimes we forget. And I think one of the advantages, as I mentioned earlier, of being old is that you do have some historical perspective on how things have evolved, right? You look at the course of your career. For me, it's year 32 in education, and you sort of look at the arc of the career and you kind of see how things have evolved. And I think that video is very well done in terms of how we collectively in education moved from one to the other. And we talk now, and I think your question is, and I know you were asking the question in the video because you know there's an answer to that, but can we do better? Can we keep evolving? What does this look like? And I love that perspective of, because you're right that, disability is seen as a deficit. And I know that I would probably be guilty of that too, in thinking that, okay, how do we correct this? Or how do we fix this? Or how do we give you some coping strategies as opposed to the true nature of inclusion that you've talked about here. So I absolutely love that. The other thing I love is your bowling analogy.
Oh, the bowling.
That's
the one that started it all, Tom.
That's right. I don't necessarily love bowling, but I love the analogy of the 7-10 split in bowling. It's a fabulous analogy in terms of the connection to inclusion and in education. So for listeners who might be unfamiliar with you and your work, can you tell them what bowling has to do with teaching and inclusive education?
Yeah. Did you know that was for a contest, that video?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so fun. And I won. It was so exciting.
It's a fantastic video. Like, honestly, it's a really great video. And so it just gets you hooked in with the bowling analogy and all of that. So, all right.
So
the floor is yours, Shelley. Let's go.
This was another moment in my life that I had a big learning. You're going to start to see a pattern. I get these metaphors when I have a big learning. So this was a big learning because I was in a bowling league when I was little, me and my brother, like over in Alberta. And they were teaching us, like we all learn, to bowl, throw the ball down the middle, maybe a little off to the side a little bit, because you want to create that domino effect. And then I saw a comic. Someone brought me a comic, and it said it was a Charlie Brown comic, and I got to get this right. So, like, I don't know, say Lucy says to Charlie, "Bowling is like teaching," and then and it's like you just roll down the middle, and Charlie's like, "Well, then you must have a bad teacher," and I didn't really get it. And then I'm like, the comic's wrong. The comic's wrong. Like, they're actually assuming that, because in my life I've seen bowling, and you know, if you look at professional bowlers, they don't ever roll it down the middle. And I'm like, the comic, that's when I made the teaching connection. I'm like, the assumption is wrong. And I'm like, okay, what if we switch this around and said, what if bowling was like teaching, but you don't aim for the middle? And so this is when I talked to a bowler. I'm like, and I talked about, where do you aim? And he's like, oh, I aim for the right pocket. And he showed me where that was. And he talked about the whole effect of the domino effect if you aim for the head pin versus if you aim for the right pocket, which actually is looking at the outside pins, the outside edges, which are actually statistically the hardest pins to hit if those are the only ones left standing. And he talks about how the outside pins are really actually powerful because they take out the whole back row. But if you aim for the head pin, you're going to get the front 3 or 4 pins, right? And I'm like, oh, this is so good. So, right? So you can see, I'm like, sweating while he's talking to me. And so I said to the guy, and I'm just like, this is such a good metaphor for teaching. And so we were kind of talking about that. So I said to him, and this isn't in the video, you'll like this. And I'm like, yeah, but like, what some teachers will say? They're like, well, let's just take the outside pins out, put them in a different lane, then we don't have to worry about them. And thus he said to me, if you take out the outside pins, you're just left with new outside pins. Isn't that so good? I have to make bowling 2.0.
Great.
I got to make a bowling 2.0, right?
That's so good.
That's so good. So the idea is, rather than aiming for your head pin, the ones who like are going to get knocked down if you just look at them, why don't we instead aim for think about the kids who are the hardest to hit in your class, who are your outside pins. Aim for them. What do they need? Do it for everybody, because the impact of that domino is way higher than if you aim for the kids who are green, the kids who do everything right, the kids who are where they should be, right? Like their impact on others or the instruction we give to head pins are going to have a way less impact than if we think about who needs the most support, who needs the most challenge, and teach within that range. You're going to get so many more kids, which then anchors to that whole, that underlying concept of universal design for learning, which we're going to talk about, which is works for one, works for all. Like,
right.
And the part that I love is that if you think about bowling, the pins knock down each other. There's no way a ball can get to every pin, which also talks about the importance of peers and the importance of community. And it's just such a good metaphor. I love it. I'm so glad it was gifted to me.
No kidding. Wow. I didn't know you could do such a deep analysis on bowling. I'm just trying to chuck the ball down the lane. I haven't bowled in probably like 20 or 30 years, but it's been a long time, but for sure. So the 7-10 split though, what that analogy there, that idea.
7-10 split. So if you do roll the ball down the middle, what often happens is you'll get the pins in the middle, but the ones left standing are the 7-10 split. And that's the hardest shot in bowling. The chances of getting that with one shot are very slim. And so usually bowlers will pick a side.
Yeah.
And so if you think about that in terms of education, often the same thing happens. You have kids who need the most support, kids who need the most challenge. So we end up picking a side, and there's always a pin left standing. So either the kids who need the most support or the kids who need the most challenge, which is why we're like, give me an EA, because we can't get to everybody, right?
Right.
And so the idea is, and you need more balls. You need more balls to get to everyone. But the idea with, aiming for the outside with that curve, it takes skill. You got to learn it. You got to practice it. It takes, you can't just huck it down, right?
Yeah.
You got to be coached. We often weren't taught how to do this, it always comes back. And then it's this idea of you'll get more on the first shot, right? You'll get more on the first teach if you aim for accessibility and challenge instead of aiming for average.
Wow. Yeah. No. Yeah, who knew that bowling could have so many layers
it's
to
my
it?
Favorite.
Did your bowling connection, your professional bowler, did they give you any insight as to how you actually deal with the 7-10 split in a real bowling sense? Not metaphorically, but actually how do we deal with that?
He was because we like in our sparring, he was like, basically you have to like nick it so that it flies across.
You got to kick it over, right?
You got to like nick it so that it goes bing. So,
so do you aim outside? You aim to the outside, right? You don't want to.
So you aim to the outside, and then it nicks it because still the pin has to knock it over because the ball.
Right.
Although there are some examples where the ball does, but it's just a physics thing, right? Like.
Yeah. And the gutter is right there, so you're living on the edge.
What's funny about that, Tom, is that when I think about like my undergrad, I was in special education, and when they talked about the outside pins in planning, the only strategy we were given was just pair up the kids who need support with the kids who need challenge. Like. It was the only strategy. And I'm like, well, isn't that just perfect for the bowling metaphor? Right. Well, they can just work to group them together.
The bowling. We're going to spend half an hour now on the bowling. We're going to take it to all layers. And
honestly,
no, it's a really good one. No, it's so insightful. It really is. It's a great way of looking at things. So you mentioned universal design for learning, and I totally am with you on the idea that so many of the strategies that we think about for students with identified special needs or English language learners, or they work for everybody, right? So let's talk about universal design for learning. I want to ask this in two parts. First, for you, what are the fundamental principles of UDL?
Okay, I got to tell you a story.
All right.
This is how I learned.
Story time with Shelley. Here we go.
Now, this metaphor isn't mine, so I got to make sure I give credit to Alexander, who came up with this quote. And you've probably heard it before. and I'm going to butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but it's something like this. He says, if a flower isn't thriving, check the soil. Have you seen that before?
No, I haven't. That's a good one.
So it's a good one, right? Because if a flower is dying, doesn't look too great, makes your garden look funny, it's very easy to clip it out and put it in the compost, right? Put your resources into getting rid of the flower. But in reality, if a flower is dying in a garden, they need water, they need light, they need to be free of slugs, they need to have space. Like the conditions that flower needs are environmental. And so this to me is UDL, because in our special education model, we put all our resources into the students. Yeah. But if we understand that disability is an identity that can't be changed, we would save some resources for the garden and for the gardener. Right. And so to me, UDL is resources for the garden. It's like, what can you do? Because if you actually understand that a plant is dying because they need more sunlight or they need more water, and you give that to the garden, all the plants are going to benefit from that. But if you only give it to the flower, then the other flowers are also going to start to die. And so to me, that's what UDL is. It's an environmental support. And that's at tier 1, right? Like, look at the garden. Let's support the gardener. But the students tell us if the flowers are wilting, that's a symptom of the garden, not a deficit in the flower. Right. And that's a really key finding, because our resources are dumped into the flowers, and it's a black hole, because there's nothing wrong with the flowers, right? And so this to me is, I think, the promise and the excitement of UDL is it changes the focus to a place-based approach and a community-based approach instead of an individual deficit-based approach. Right. And so thinking about then UDL from the big picture, it basically says, like, what's the sunlight, what's the water, and what's the space that all plants need, right? And so looking about that in terms of learning, it's looking at how do we engage students? How do we help them understand, receive and understand new information? And how do we help them express that? Those are their basic needs. That's the formula for learning. And, but understanding that there might be plants that need more water. There might be plants that need more shade. There might be plants that need some companion plants. Not all plants are the same, but there are basic needs. And that, if we can attend to the basic needs, it reduces the crisis, so we can actually then look at individual needs. And so that, when I think of UDL, that's what I think of it as. How do we provide those basic needs for everybody? Bring down the crisis so we can actually look at individual needs, which are then those kind of tier 2, tier 3 of that layered approach of support.
It's very intimidating, though, for teachers when they think about the idea of providing support for everyone. And I think at first, when people not familiar with UDL, there is that level of overwhelmed, they feel overwhelmed by the prospect of trying to attend. So how do I do that as a classroom teacher?
Well, the thing is, and this is the part that, sometimes I might get people mad at me for, because UDL is a brilliant framework, but the irony that UDL is so inaccessible to teachers, it is so filled with jargon. It is not written for educators. I work with teachers that are just oh no, I tried UDL. And I'm right?
Didn't work.
But I read it, and one of the UDL principles is heightened salience. I'm what does that mean? It's not accessible. And the irony that UDL has so many barriers as a framework, I am not surprised that all the teachers are overwhelmed, because I was. I'm I don't know what any of these words. Very, very cryptic. And
so make it accessible to us now, Shelley.
No, okay. So so UDL, there's I think about those 3 parts of the brain. 3 parts of the brain. And those 3 parts of the brain have to be highlighted in all of us to learn. Okay, we all have to be engaged. We all have to receive information and understand it. We all have to share it. That's basically the goals of education. Now, what UDL is useful for is that historically, and this now is going to connect now to other frameworks, is historically we have followed a forwards design model, which is everyone has to do the same task to prove that they've met a goal. And if you can't do the task, then you need an adaptation or a modification, which then compromises the goal. It's super problematic. And so part of understanding UDL is also understanding a backwards design process where not everyone has to do the same task. Everyone has to meet the same goal. The destination is the goal. The destination is not a 5-paragraph synthesis essay and reading The Outsiders. We have to know what the goal is. And this is your work. You know this. So what UDL says is, if you actually know what your goal is, this is your destination, right?
Yeah.
A 5-paragraph essay is one way to get there for sure. But what are other ways? What are other ways to engage kids? What are other ways to receive information? What are other ways to understand? What are other ways for students to express? Because historically, the only way that we've relied on is compliance. Do
Yeah.
this because I told you. Do this because you need to. Do this because you're going to university. Like there's nothing intrinsic about it, and so it's not surprising that fewer and fewer kids are engaging based on compliance alone. And so, for example, one example of teaching in ways that provide multiple pathways for kids to engage, bringing in different text sets, right? Like, having a common theme and thread amongst texts with different levels and different characters and different, interest levels, because if kids have choice, they're going to engage more. A way for kids to increase motivation, which is maintaining engagement over time. They need to know why they're doing what they're doing, right? Like, what is the learning goal in a student-friendly context, right? Like, do they know why they're reading this? Do they know why they're doing this? And so at a very simple level, it's like, what do all kids need? And how do we provide multiple pathways to get to that same destination? Because then you don't have to adapt or modify anything.
Right.
And if we're not adapting or modifying anything, then it doesn't actually affect evaluation at all. But there is like this deep guilt or something that especially secondaries hold, that think that if we provide a different pathway, that it's cheating.
Right.
That we're
Yeah.
nope, it's cheating. But especially in British Columbia, where if you actually look at the goals, unless it says write, unless it says speak, unless
Exactly.
it's, you don't
Yeah.
have to do that. And so I think
Yeah.
that this is like, how do you teach the spin bowling with a spin? Like, this requires really important professional development and communities of practice and learning, where teachers can ask these hard questions and almost be given permission to say, it's okay.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we abandon writing,
No.
but it does mean that we have to know what the goal is, and we have to provide different ways to get there.
If you were to take a look at how we gather evidence of learning in many places, it's such a narrow scope
Yes.
of methods. And you're right that learning goals, standards, whatever you want to call them,
Yeah.
they very rarely dictate the assessment method. I mean, they dictate the assessment method, but not the format. So a constructed response question doesn't have to be done in writing. It can be done orally. It can be done in many different formats, visually. So I think that your point is so well taken, that we've got to interrogate and zoom out and look at how we gather evidence of learning. We're going to talk about assessment later in this conversation, but it's such an important point that sometimes we think that certain outcomes, we have to do it this way. And you're right. If it doesn't say write, if it doesn't say speak, if it doesn't say that, then we have so much flexibility in how we gather evidence. So I'm thinking about the second part of this question was really about UDL. My colleagues and I use a phrase in our most recent book. We used a phrase, a section in each chapter. It was about student investment, self-assessment, all of that. We called it dangerous detours and seductive shortcuts, which, yeah. So when it comes to UDL, and you think about UDL, what are those dangerous detours and seductive shortcuts that people might say, oh, I do UDL, but I'm not really. It's kind of UDL light.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not really doing it. So what are some of those dangerous detours and seductive shortcuts?
And I think, and you know what, and I actually understand why people do it, is the UDL strategies that people employ are the ones they understand, right? Which are, we give them multiple ways, that give them choice in different ways. Like, basically, when I see UDL, I see choice in question, choice of example, choice of book to read, which is great. Right. But that's pretty much it. You know what I mean? When we actually get into the deeper parts of UDL, which harness student assessment and our student self-assessment and formative feedback and helping kids to be in charge of their learning, that's where I think we fall off. But if you look at UDL, at the very, very top of the principles, those are the most accessible ones. And that's what I see, because they're the most accessible. But I also, if you look at the more complex or like strategies, they're not clear. So I also understand why UDL isn't deeply practiced, because I don't think teachers understand what that means. I think another difficulty with UDL is a lot of people think it's a special education initiative that's just for special needs students, instead of understanding that this is for the garden, this is for everybody. Like every strategy on UDL does not compromise evaluation. Like
That's right.
anyone can use these strategies, so we have to teach them, but they're not going to get to
Yeah.
kids if teachers don't know what they are. And so I think that it's really demystifying and separating UDL from adaptations. Like that's old language. That's really old language. We're not doing that anymore. This is about what are different pathways? What does this look like? How do we get kids to take ownership of their learning? But that's
Mhm.
also not how probably any of us grew up.
Right.
Right. And we hold on to what we know and understanding, oh, the UDL bandwagon or, oh, this new UDL thing. I'm like, UDL is not new. It's just
I know.
very misunderstood. It's not understood. And so when I think about those shortcuts, I think people are like, oh, yeah, I gave them choice of a question. I'm doing UDL. And I'm like, it's so much deeper than that. And I think like UDL is a language, it's a muscle that you constantly have to build and understand over time, which is why this takes like deep professional learning to really truly understand. The promise of it is incredible, but there needs to be some serious demystification. Otherwise those detours and shortcuts are just going to be very, very shallow attempts,
Right.
and not actually impact the learners where they need.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you talk about this idea that UDL is what we do in response if you can't learn, quote unquote, the normal way. I teach you
Exactly.
the normal way,
Exactly.
then I'll do UDL for you because you need something special.
No.
We really have to. I love that
Mhm.
word, demystify
Mhm.
the notion of UDL and how
Mhm.
it's a front end decision about how we create access and entry points for all learners. And
Yeah.
I think that mindset shift is good. So, Shelley, I want to finish up by discussing assessment, of course, because
My
obviously
favorite.
my favorite as well, of course. The listeners know that. A phrase that always rings in my ear, and
Mhm.
it's something obviously I didn't invent this phrase, but this phrase of the soft bigotry of low expectations is one that really rings in my ear. So on the one hand, of course, we need to be attentive to the unique needs of our learners, especially those with identified special needs, et cetera. But on the other hand, we can't be too quick to adjust expectations as we do, because we could end up impeding their success as opposed to supporting them.
Mhm.
So, and the other phrase I hear from people sometimes, this is not a lot, this is not even most, this is just enough to notice.
Mhm.
Oh, Tom, you don't understand, our kids can't do that,
Oh, I hear that
or
all the
those
time,
kids
Tom.
can't do that. So here's my question:
Yeah.
where's the balance?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, we want to create
Mhm.
this idea of being supportive to all learners and
Mhm.
be attentive to their needs, but at the same time, we really do want to
Mhm.
push forward with this idea that all learners can reach high levels of intellectual performance and can reach their full potential. So where's the balance for you, Shelley, in that whole
Well,
assessment realm?
I think that the key learning that I had around balance of assessment was moving away from benchmarks, right? Because if
Okay.
there's a benchmark where everyone should be, there's going to be kids who can't do it.
Right.
Just like there's kids who could go further and don't, right? And so when I think about the balance, I think the work around making, instead of like benchmarks, but looking at windows where
Okay.
we're planning for a range, we're planning for variability instead of planning for average. Okay.
Right.
And so I'm really excited about a lot of the work around like learner progressions, etc. Except accessibility is still not considered. Like even
Right.
within the continuums that are provided or that are being constructed, they start at grade level. And so basically that eliminates many kids, because if we start at where they should be, and that's not in the zone of proximal development, right?
Yeah.
Kids are going to fall off, right? And it's so much easier to add on complexity than it is to take away. And so
Right.
then this comes back to that adaptation and modification. Oh, they can't do it, so let's modify for them. Let's adapt for them, and it becomes this retrofit approach. And so where I see the possibility of progressions is actually not starting at grade level, having a really clear continuum of grade level, but also creating what I like to call an access point, which is not at grade level, but it is designed specifically for the kids who need it in the class as a stepping stone to get to grade level. So it provides a
Right.
scaffold. And so some people have said, well, that's watering down curriculum. I'm like, no, not if you go past it. Like if we taught this access point and stayed there, absolutely, that's super problematic. But like as we know, like kids will have a higher chance of moving to more complex thinking if they start with success, right? If they start with success,
Right.
if we chunk it, if we kind of create little stepping stones. And I think like in BC, for example, we have the 4-point scale.
Mhm.
And I think it needs to be 5 because, like having kids approaching and acknowledging you're always going to have kids who are approaching grade level. So let's use that as a
Mhm.
scaffold to say, this is where we're starting for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? Like, what's
Yeah.
the assumed knowledge that we think kids have or can do? And like, it meets the needs of kids with prior knowledge. It meets the needs of kids with intellectual disabilities because sometimes that becomes their IEP goal. It meets the needs of kids who can do grade level, but they need like support and success to get there. And a lot of kids are approaching, but we don't celebrate that. And so instead, they drop off. They drop off.
Right.
The step is too high for them. And so
Right.
it's not that they can't do it, they just need a stepping stool and throw the wrench of COVID in there. No one is where they should be. And so like
Exactly.
I love the work of continuums, but we're still building continuums from average and beyond
Right.
instead of being like, what are the range of the actual kids in front of you?
Mhm.
We have to build our continuums to match the range of our kids. And as
Yeah.
long as everyone is taught everything, everyone has the opportunity to go further. And so part of the research that I did was I worked with, in the professional development sequence, helping teachers to create access points to their grade level instruction designed
Right.
specifically for the student who was there. And 2 of the kids passed the course, like with credit, because you know what I mean? They got to minimum. But
Yeah.
that is the difference between graduating and not. Like, that can change trajectory of kids' life. And so I think like
Yeah.
even the word like proficiency for one column is problematic because technically it's looking at how do we take grade level proficiency and make it into a scaffolded window of success, because
Yeah.
if kids are in the window, that's successful for a whole bunch of kids. But so I think like, how do we balance that? We balance that by actually creating assessment models that match the actual range of kids who are in front of us, not the kids who were there 10 years ago.
Right.
Right? To be
Right.
like, who is here? Being very clear about what grade level it is. Like, this isn't about abandoning curriculum, but making
No.
sure it's accessible and challenging at the same time, designing for the kids on the edges, teaching it to everybody. But then
Yeah.
this is the part that I think is really critical for UDL, is helping kids to make that decision about the level of complexity they're showing evidence of, right? And having
Right.
kids be a part of that assessment conversation, because that's where that motivation piece comes from. That's
Absolutely.
my soapbox of assessment, Tom. Change it.
bringing kids inside. I mean, that's the topic of our latest book,
Well,
and
that's it.
bringing
That's
kids
it.
inside the assessment process. It's so critical because
Mhm.
I learned from Rick Stiggins 20 years ago that
Mhm.
the person who does the assessing does the learning, and bringing.
Exactly.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
we've got to bring them inside that
Yeah.
process. And so when I work with schools and
Yeah.
teachers, it's you're developing your expertise so you can teach the students how to do this for themselves. It's not
Mhm.
your expertise is not the end goal.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, some people might look at watering down the curriculum and
And
maybe
it is if that's where
yeah,
you stop.
that's right. But maybe,
Yeah.
to use your analogy,
Mhm.
maybe the garden needs water.
Maybe the garden needs water. Everyone
That's
needs
right.
water, not just one.
Everyone
And
needs water. The garden,
I
yeah,
like
absolutely.
having an accessible starting point hurts nobody.
No, it hurts nobody, and I think that we just get into this rut
Mhm.
of thinking, and yeah.
Mhm.
So it's a Shelley. I could talk about this with you all
All
day for
day,
sure.
Tom.
Fantastic, I love it. But as we finish up here, I've got 2 questions left
Okay.
as we finish up, and these are questions I ask everyone
Mhm.
who come on the podcast. The first one, a little heavier.
Yeah.
And you can take this in any direction you
Mhm.
want to, but the first question I want to finish with is educationally speaking,
Yeah.
what keeps you up at night?
Oh, Tom, this is so hard because everything does. But I'll pick one.
Pick one
If I were
or
to pick
2.
one, what keeps me up at night, and we've talked about this, is the view that disability is a deficit.
Yeah.
Like, we got to change that, and we know that that's not appropriate for every other identity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, like, as a queer person, I always kind of bring this back to my experience, and like,
Sure.
if someone said, like, when I came out, everyone told my mom, "Oh, I'm so sorry."
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm just like it's devastating. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, I never felt more free and happy and positive as when I started to own that identity. And I think that for my kids, like, I want my kids that I work with to come up and be like, I have autism. Isn't that amazing? And I'm like, yes. But like, they're never gonna say that unless we surround them with the narrative and the perspectives that autism is a part of this world, and Down syndrome is a part of this world, and disability is a part of this world that makes this world brighter, not heavier. And that's probably what keeps me awake, because you can't force people to see that.
No,
Yeah.
that's a big one,
Yeah.
and certainly, yeah. I mean that's a different perspective for many, and certainly trying to see it as part of the identity and part of what is the fabric of our society, as opposed to looking at it as a deficit or that you are less than. I hear you on that for sure. So finally, we're going to end on a lighter note. I love food, and you live on Bowen Island, and I can't remember the last time I was on Bowen Island.
Have you been?
I look, it's got to be 30 plus years since I've been on Bowen. But I don't even know I couldn't name the year when I was on Bowen Island, so I haven't been. But I like to ask people where the best place to eat is, and it doesn't have to be high end, low end, doesn't matter, hole in the wall, food truck. I don't care. Where's the best place to eat on Bowen Island?
Here's the thing about Bowen. We have 4 restaurants.
Okay.
So I'm going to tell you the best place on Bowen to eat is my house. Because my wife is a baker and she is a chef. And if you come to Bowen, you're going to call me up and I'm going to invite you over for dinner.
All right. So I'm going to knock on your door and Shelley, I'm here. You told me I could come over for I hope the baking is done.
I don't know how I lucked out with this life, but
love it.
I am not a cook, but she is. And whew.
All right, let's go to Vancouver. So we know Bowen Island is the best place to eat. So let's go to the Metro Vancouver area. Okay. When you're in the Vancouver area, favorite place to eat?
Oh, this is a hard one.
Just one. Doesn't have to be number one.
Okay,
just the
you know
first
what?
One
For our family, our kind of go-to fave is burgoo.
Oh,
we love burgoo. Those little gooey cheese sandwiches.
Delicious. All right,
delicious. Mm-hmm. It's our comfort food. We go in the winter.
Yeah, you got to love that comfort food for sure. Fantastic. So if I'm on Bowen Island, you hear the doorbell ring, you'll know it's me, and I expect the baking to be finished and ready to smell. I have expectations, Shelley.
Fresh out of the oven.
I'll give you a 1-day warning for sure, and Virgo when we're in the Vancouver area for sure. Listeners, you can and you absolutely should follow Shelley. She is everywhere. Twitter, the handle is @tweetsomemore and Moore. You just use your name. So
I love my name.
Such a clever way. Absolutely.
Helps me remember.
Absolutely. Instagram, it's @5moreminutes. And again, more being with 2 O's. 5 More Minutes on Facebook. You, of course, have the podcast and the YouTube channel, which is fabulous, 5 More Minutes. And the website, yes, you guessed it, 5moreminutes.com. Shelley, this was a fantastic conversation. Time just flies. I really appreciate your insight. It was a great conversation. I've learned a lot from you already, and really appreciate you doing this. Thank you.
No, anytime. And keep doing the good work, hey?
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. You can find out more at teachbetter.com/podcasts. Now let's get back to the episode.
In Assessment Corner this week, I want to talk a little bit about portfolios, because I do think portfolios can be a really great collection tool, but we have to be focused on what the purpose of the portfolio is, and I think that's where some schools and or teachers kind of miss the mark. Susan Belgrad did a nice job of summarizing some of the most important aspects of the research around portfolios, and she did this in the SAGE Handbook of Research on Classroom Assessment that was published back in 2013. Now, she wrote in that summary that portfolios can be an important component of a comprehensive evaluation system. Comprehensive systems of evaluation that include portfolios of student performance have been proposed for years, she says, and they have been proposed for a number of different reasons. The first, she submits, is that traditional assessments assume that knowledge has universal meanings, whereas knowledge is actually complex and can have multiple meanings and perspectives, and that's where a portfolio can come in. The second assertion she makes is that standardized assessments treat learning as a passive process, whereas portfolios treat learning as an active process in which students are engaged in the search for meaning. And the third suggestion is that testing, she says, emphasizes the mastery of discrete and isolated bits of information or knowledge, but advocates of student-centered learning believe the emphasis of assessment should be placed on both the process as well as the products of learning. And finally, more overarching, she suggests that the most central point or view of portfolios is that portfolios focus on how the ongoing processes of student inquiry capture the cognitive abilities that successful achievement and engage students themselves as participants in the instructional design and authentic assessment of key learning events in different subject areas. So portfolios, have been around since I started teaching, and the idea has always been there. She goes on to add that portfolios can serve a variety of purposes and take on a variety of forms. And this is what I want to focus on here. I would say often, but not always, portfolios are implemented for the right reasons, but unfortunately the purpose of the portfolio is not thought through. I think this is one of the most important parts that's missing often. It's an important first step in the successful implementation of any portfolio system, especially long term. If we're going to utilize portfolios, then let's make sure we're clear on what purpose we want the portfolio to serve. And then let's go about the business of fulfilling that purpose. And I want to be clear, there's no purpose that's superior to another. That's not the issue. The issue is that, I don't take any issue with any of the purposes. My point is to say that let's not say we're doing one thing, but then end up doing another. Right? So the purposes, she says, are the learning portfolio, the developmental portfolio, assessment portfolio, and a showcase portfolio. So let's not pretend we're doing a learning portfolio when in fact in execution and implementation, what we're doing is a showcase portfolio, right? If you want the portfolio to be substantive, then we can't turn it into show and tell. So let me go through each of these 4 types that she outlined and give you a little bit of perspective on them, right? The first one is the learning portfolio. This is a portfolio that captures evidence of knowledge and skills to provide a holistic picture of learning and achievement over time. So for me, the word that comes to mind is overall or holistic, right? A learning portfolio, it's kind of the view from 30,000 feet. Like, this is what the learner has learned. Here's all the knowledge and skills, and it provides a holistic picture for the learner. Now, if you want a developmental portfolio, that's different. That's a developmental portfolio focuses on growth. This is where you demonstrate continued growth and development as a reader, a writer, a critical thinker, whatever it might be. So showing growth has a different purpose than showing overall achievement. And so that's the difference between a learning portfolio and developmental portfolio. So again, you can see that if we say, well, we want a portfolio that shows growth, but in execution, it looks more like a learning portfolio, then we're not fulfilling the purpose of the promise that we were looking for. Then she says a third type of portfolio is the assessment portfolio. And this is where we capture evidence of achievement of benchmarks or standards, how criteria are met, and we start talking about plans for improvement, which is a little bit of growth. But the thing that I think of when it comes to an assessment portfolio is details. I think of specificity. I think of specific criteria. I think the idea is drilling down a little bit, right? So the learning portfolio is about a holistic view of the learner. The developmental portfolio is about growth, and the assessment portfolio is more about the details and getting sort of drilling down. And she finally talks about the showcase portfolio, which is basically just inviting students to focus on and communicate and celebrate their individual achievements, their talents. This is kind of the show and tell portfolio. And this, to me, the word that comes to mind is expansive. It's like we can include anything in this portfolio because really it's kind of a superficial view. Now, I don't mean superficial view in the sense that it doesn't matter because I'm celebrating my talents or showcasing things like that, but we're not drilling down necessarily to criteria. We're just saying, here's what I'm good at, or here's what I've accomplished. So don't think of surface level or superficial as something dismissive. It is what it is. If you want the portfolio to be show and tell, and you want parents and families to just see what their children are doing, no problem with that. So if you're not currently implementing any kind of portfolio system, but you want to, then I would really encourage you to think through the purpose of that portfolio system before you do any implementation. What purpose do we want the portfolio to serve? Now, if you have implemented a portfolio system, maybe now's a good time to audit your purpose and determine whether or not you thought through with some level of clarity and some level of specificity what purpose you wanted the portfolio to serve. And if you haven't, then maybe we need to reinvigorate, maybe we need to reset, maybe we need to do something that will help us kind of get focused and make sure the portfolio fulfills the promise that we were hoping it would. And again, this would go for either a tangible portfolio or an online portfolio. And I would even also say this of programs like Seesaw and others where we implement these systems of communication, but maybe we haven't thought through the purpose and therefore aren't really fulfilling any kind of purpose to its nth degree. That to me is a really important aspect. Now, the other aspect I would add is consumability. Because conceptually, I think it's hard to argue with the idea of a portfolio. But then when you start to think about how long it can take to examine a portfolio, we might think twice about it. This idea has been around for the entirety of my career. And yet, with rare exceptions, it's often implemented in an unsustainable way. And I think one of the reasons is, and it's certainly not the only reason, but one of the reasons is that teachers and administrators haven't thought through the purpose of the portfolio, aren't fulfilling its intended use with enough detail so that long-term sustainability is possible. If you were to, for example, use the portfolio as a kind of self-assessment or peer assessment exercise, then you could distribute the workload and students could be in a position where they're making some assessment decisions about what's next or what was achieved and so on, right? So that workload aspect, again, what purpose does the portfolio serve? For me, like most things, the success of a portfolio doesn't hinge on the idea itself. It hinges on the implementation strategy that schools employ. Administrators and teachers need to think through what purpose does the portfolio serve. There is this cliche, of course, that says, slow down to speed up. And I think there's no place where that cliche is more applicable than when it comes to the implementation of a portfolio system.
3, 2, 1.
Okay, that's it for this week. Remember to follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. Also, please email the podcast, tomshimmerpod@gmail.com, if you've got assessment corner questions or if you have any suggestions or feedback for me about the podcast. And a reminder to check the show notes for links for all the upcoming professional learning events coming up this spring. Next time, episode 99, my guest will be Jessica Vance. Jessica is an advocate for inquiry-based learning. She's also the author of Leading with a Lens of Inquiry, Cultivating Conditions for Curiosity and Empowering Agency. And that's what we're going to focus on for our conversation. Please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, especially on Apple Podcasts. But a rating and review on any platform will help grow the podcast's reach. And if you like what you hear, please keep spreading the word about the podcast to your friends, your colleagues, or on social media. I would really appreciate that. Have a great week, everyone.